Welcome everybody, you are watching Robot Rallis, and today we're going to be going through some of the new spoilers for All Will Be One, starting with, of course, All Will Be One. Going to be talking a bit about Standard, a bit about Commander, and a lot about Limited. So if you don't like that, that's okay. I'm sure there are content creators out there for you. We're just going to jump right into it. If you feel like I'm talking too slowly, feel free to speed up the video to 1.25 or 1.5x speed. I will not be offended. Starting off with All Will Be One, this is a 5-mana enchantment that cares about putting counters on things. In Limited, at least, you need to be putting a whole lot of counters on things for me to want to do this. 5-mana enchantments that don't do anything when you play them, not the best in Limited. You can ask a lot of Limited players about that. Usually they have to have a pretty high ceiling for you to even want to consider it. And this one doesn't just have a high ceiling, it also has a very high setup cost. Now, there are some things that put multiple oil counters on them, but a lot of those, from what I've seen, have been rares. Like, if you play this and then play your Archfiend of the Dross, that gets 4 oil counters, cool. You could do 4 damage to a creature, and you've crafted a bad removal spell out of your 5-mana do-nothing enchantment that required a rare to do something. Not really what I'm interested in. In Commander, I'm sure this will be more interesting, because it'll fit straight into the goofy Super Friends deck, because it turns out you are putting counters on permanents, so that's pretty cool. You can also play this with things like Contagion Engine, and then get a shitload of counters all across the board, and then just hit somebody for like 10 or whatever. Pretty goofy stuff that you could do with this in Commander. In Standard, I would be very surprised if this does anything. I don't really think the format's really in a place where this is gonna do anything at all. Just seems very slow there. Next up we have Jace, and Jace is in fact completed. Jace has some pretty cool abilities, and we're gonna go through them now. You can play Jace for 4 mana to get the full 5 loyalty, or you can play Jace for 3 mana and 2 life to get a 3 loyalty planeswalker that can immediately plus up to 4 and give a creature -3/-0 until your next turn. Until your next turn is a pretty big deal, because it means that creature won't be able to attack you, or more importantly, Jace as profitably. In Limited, this is a pretty big game, because if you can play this on turn 3, whether you're on the play or the draw, it's going to be pretty easy to blank any aggression that might be coming Jace's way, especially if you played a 2-drop on turn 2 right before Jace. They're going to try and ram creatures into this thing, and you're going to make it as hard as you possibly can for that to happen. -2 is a little bit mediocre. I don't like spending 2 loyalty to draw 1 card, and then in the late game maybe draw 3 cards, because at that point the game's probably almost over anyway. But it's there if you're pretty desperate, or you just don't have anything else you want to do with that loyalty. And then -X, this is the real moneymaker if you ask me. Target player mills 3 times X cards. So if you pay the full price on Jace, it immediately comes in with 5, and you can cash that in for 15 cards. There are actually a surprising number of games of Limited where milling your opponent for 15, just randomly, will win the game. And it is nice that you have that utility, in addition to having all the other things this Planeswalker can do. Even if the card draw is mediocre, the -3/-0 actually is a pretty good deal. Especially for only 3 mana, and you can eventually cash this in for at least 1 card if you really want to. Now, one thing that you need to remember is that the later the game goes, the better that -X gets. And if you have that Jace out for more than 1 or 2 turns, you could tick up a few times, and then minus for an even bigger amount. So let's say that you -7. That's 21 cards. That's half of your opponent's deck. A lot of games get to the point where you only have 20 cards left in your deck. That's like turn 10-ish or so. It's pretty easy for the game to drag out that long, especially if you have any kind of board stall, or there's not a lot of great removal or flying creatures flying around. That said, I don't know if it's good enough for Limited, and I don't think it's going to be especially good in Commander. -3/-0 on 1 single creature is just not enough to protect you. Next up we have Farraska. Farraska, unfortunately, is also completed. My Bay, the Queen of Sting, is unfortunately part Phyrexian now. And you can play her for 6 mana or 5 mana and 2 life for 6 loyalty or 4 loyalty respectively. And you get some pretty cool abilities, reminiscent of Obnixilis, the one that, well, basically did the first ability and second ability, which is essentially +1, you draw a card and lose 1 life with some extra bonuses because you get to put counters on whatever you want. That's pretty cool. -2 does get rid of a creature, but they get a treasure. That's not the biggest downside in the world. You are getting rid of an entire creature. Them getting an additional 1 mana out of it to sacrifice if they so choose is relatively marginal, especially by the time you're getting to like the 5-6 mana turns of the game. And then the -9, pretty powerful, especially with how much proliferate there is inside the format. I'm talking from a limited perspective, of course. In Standard, I don't really know if this is good enough to break through, which is kind of goofy to say because it's quite strong, but it might just not be good enough, who knows. Commander, I also think this isn't really strong enough. I'm sure you will play it in the decks where you want to proliferate every turn, but I just don't think it gets there as far as a standalone Planeswalker. You need to have a lot of support for this thing to do anything there. But limited, I think this is going to be a real beater, especially if you have any kind of way to poison your opponent. They're going to have the screws kind of, turned on them pretty quickly. If you can get any poison counters, start pumping up your creatures with +1/+1 counters, have oil counters on your creatures that you could take off for cool benefits. Pretty strong there. Now we have some Domini, and these Domini all have very interesting effects. They all can get an indestructible counter, and they all have really cool static abilities or triggered abilities. This one is a 4 mana 4/4 that basically has the text of Anointed Procession, doubling the number of tokens that you make whenever you would make tokens. You can also pay 1 a Phyrexian white and a Phyrexian white to also sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures for that indestructible counter. As far as Standard goes, I have no idea how to rate these. I don't know how much exile there is in the format, or how much bounce there is, or if it's going to be easy for decks to just not care about indestructible creatures. But build-arounds like this, they tend to kind of underperform a little bit, unless there's just an already existing incredibly good deck for that style of gameplay. And I don't know how much mono white token generation there is in the format right now. I know there's a lot of high-quality white creatures, but I don't know how good the tokens are. I'm sure there's be some pretty interesting stuff in Alchemy with like double-team creatures and whatever, but I don't really know exactly what's going down in Standard. As far as Limited, this is going to be quite powerful. There's a good number of things that make mites, and making double mites is pretty strong. And then, of course, getting an indestructible 4/4 is no joke at all. There's some pretty goofy stuff you could do with that. Commander, obviously going to be a mainstay there. People like doubling their tokens. There are treasure tokens and creature tokens off the top of my head that are very, very cool to copy and get doubles of. Obviously going to be pretty popular there. Probably in the command zone as well as in the 99. And I'm pretty sure there's going to be multiple card styles of this, so hopefully the prices won't be too high if that's something you're looking to pick up. Next up is Terranex Rex, which seems to be almost a completed Carnage Tyrant, because it has a lot of similar enough abilities. We have Trample, we have Can't Be Countered, we also get Ward 4 and Haste and Toxic 4, which is interesting because it costs 7 mana. So we have 8/8 in the power and toughness, Ward 4, Toxic 4, 4 abilities past Can't Be Countered, but we have a 7 mana cost. Really? Fair enough, I guess. They don't really like symmetry these days. I think they just like to tick us off sometimes. Either way, this is going to be a pretty powerful anti-control card, although control's not especially good in Standard anyway. Obviously, you won't be able to counter this in any format, but Standard is the one where cards like this tended to shine the most, because people aren't countering a lot of spells in Limited, and in Commander, people will just wipe the board. Haste is a big game, meaning that you'll almost certainly be able to swing in at least once with this. I do think that there's some interesting contrast between 8/8 and Toxic 4, because if you're swinging in with 8/8 and your opponent gets 4 poison counters, it feels like you'll kill them quick enough with the 8/8 that the poison won't matter, but maybe not. Maybe you have an opponent that's gained a lot of life. It's just interesting to me. It feels like it should probably have a higher toxic value than that, but maybe they tested it. I don't know how much testing they do over there. Limited, it's a big top-end threat. It's going to do what big top-end threats do and kill your opponent. It's one of the better ones because it does have haste and trample and ward 4, but at the end of the day, it is just a big control finisher, and there are definitely going to be stronger rares in the set. Drivnod, Dominus of the Massacre, is next, and this Dominus has, I think, the highest chance of breaking out into Standard of the ones that they've released so far. This is a 5-mana 8/3 that doubles the triggers that you get from creatures dying on any permanent you control. You can also pay Phyrexian black, and exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard to get an indestructible counter. Indestructible 8/3 hits pretty goddamn hard. It's going to be kind of difficult to just profitably block that at any stage of the game, so it basically turns into an abyss. Your opponent's going to block it, or they're going to take 8 damage every turn. They need to block it because 8 damage is just way too much. And of course, it's a big giant stone wall blocker if you need one of those. I think if it's going to go anywhere, it will be Standard, mono black, if it's going to be a constructive format besides obviously Commander, because Commander, obviously, doubling your death triggers going to be pretty big, and then an indestructible 8/3 also fucks pretty well there too. The 5 mana cost is what really makes this a consideration in Standard, because at the 4 slot, there's just way too many choices already. You already have Shouldered, they're printing Phyrexian Obliterator, just too many things competing for that 4-drop slot that if this was 4, there'd just be no shot that it would make it to Standard. But 5, maybe so. Definitely a card I'm not looking to play against in Limited. I'm going to die to it often, I'm sure. 3 creature cards in your graveyard, pretty easy to do, even as soon as turn 5, to be honest. Just like dump a few things in there, your turn 2, turn 3, and turn 4. It's not that difficult to find a way to get those to die, but more often than not, you'll be like turn 6, turn 7, before you can routinely put that many creatures in the graveyard, immediately put in the counter, and make sure that this creature's going to stick around for a little while. Zopandrel, the Dominus of Hunger, is our green Dominus, and at first glance it looks a little bit meager as a 7-mana 4/6, but you need to read on it has reach, and at the start of each combat double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of combat. That means it will be in combat as a 8/12. Of course, if it takes 6 damage during combat, at the end of combat it will in fact die, because at end of combat it'll have 6 toughness again, and it'll have 6 damage marked on it. Of course, it also has the ability to put an indestructible counter on itself, so if for some reason your opponents decide to throw 6 damage at this thing, you can then just sacrifice 2 creatures and put an indestructible counter on it. Sacrificing 2 creatures is a pretty hefty cost, and a surprising one to see out of a mono-green card, but it's not that crazy, and I don't think it's going to be that difficult either. In Limited, it's going to be a bit more difficult, but Standard, where I don't even think it's going to see play anyway, it'll be easier, which is unfortunate. Limited, of course, it's just going to be a big giant beater. You're going to play it, double the size of all your things, attack your opponent, and if they try to blow it up, you're going to pay 4 life and save it. And that's going to be pretty cool. You will be trading 2 for 1, because you'll be sacrificing 2 creatures to trade for their removal spell, but at the end of it you'll have an indestructible 4/6 that becomes an 8/12, and they will have 1 less removal spell, and removal spells are less common than creatures are. So pretty cool. As far as Commander, it's a little hefty in the mana cost. Maybe it'll see play in some, big stuff decks, but I think there's just better stuff to play. Sulfim, Dominus of Mayhem, is our red Dominus, and this is a 4-mana 5/4 that has a 1 attached to its indestructible counter ability, meaning that you not only have to pay the Phyrexian mana, double red, but you also have to pay 1, which means they know how powerful this card is. The ability itself isn't actually that interesting to me. It does double up your burn spells, but I don't know how relevant that is in Standard. I think you're looking more to crash in with creatures, which this also does well, but we'll get there. If a source you control will deal non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. Your lightning bolts hit for 6, and so on and so forth. Anytime there's a 5 power, 4 mana creature that can get indestructible, Standard tends to take notice. This one has a little bit of work that you have to put into it, because you do have to also discard 2 cards. But I think that some decks, if there's not a lot of prevalent ways to get rid of indestructible creatures, will do this. If there are ways to easily get rid of this, I could see this card just ending up in the bulk bin, as it were, as an unfortunate, what is the word I'm looking for? An unfortunate victim of the suite of removal that we happen to have in the format right now. That said, that's all I've got for you today. There's a lot of spoilers that were released, more than I could possibly count or read off for you today. I will be releasing a limited set review pretty much as soon as I've translated all these, or as soon as they're easily available for me to read. I do have work up until Saturday, so hopefully by then they will be all translated and ready for me to go through. Not sure if I'm going to be having a returning guest, so it might just be me. But you can also find my articles at hipstersofthecoast.com, and you can definitely look forward to a limited primer on Phyrexia All Will Be One from yours truly. Go ahead and look me up on that website, author Luca Farraska. If you look me up by my author name, you'll be able to find all the articles that I've written over the last several months. I'm also going to have some deck techs and archetype guides ready after the first few days of the format, after I've had a chance to cram a few dozen drafts. I thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you've enjoyed this minor breakdowns of some of these cool cards. And if you can speak Spanish or don't mind looking up translations, I encourage you to go check out Mythic Spoiler and take a look at some of these cards. They're really cool. All of the arts are very beautiful and interesting, very unique, just so different from a whole lot of the stuff that we see in Magic routinely. I like how they've kind of doubled down on some of the motifs of individual writers, like how blue we have all of the eyes and tentacles, and in white we're doubling down on the Elishnorn sort of headdresses and plated armor bits. It all just reeks of cool flavor to me, and I'm a big flavor fanatic myself. It may seem like I'm a bit of a spike since I focus a lot on winning limited, but like, look at this. Look at how beautiful this card is. Look at this. This is amazing. This is incredible art. I remember when I saw this art when they released it on Twitter, I was so excited about it. It just is so cool. People were talking about how horrifying and scary it is, freaky, but it looks so nice. Just conceptually imagine being an artist and coming up with something like this. It's so creative and one of the coolest parts of Magic, if you ask me. Anyway, I've rambled long enough. Thank you for tuning in. Please feel free to leave a comment. Please feel free to like the video. And please feel free to subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at HonestlyUnusual. And that's all I've got. Have a nice day, y'all.